afternoon, everybody. It is about time that we do the third part. So, without further ado, like and subscribe. Let's continue.
Gang, this band of dead sons begins to march off and they enter an abandoned Apache village. When they get there, Glanton finds an abandoned.
Okay, I'm gonna back it up a bit.
Ever since then, his life has been defined by violence and hate and murder. And perhaps it seems the judge's ideal person, ideal of what a son should be, is what the kid already is. The next day, the gang, this band of dead sons, begins to march off and they enter an abandoned Apache village. When they get there, Glanton finds an abandoned dog. So Glanton manages to feed it with a piece of jerky, and for the rest of the story, Glanton keeps this dog at his side. Now, it's up to you if this means that Glanton is an animal lover and shows compassion for animals, or if he just shows compassion for things that will do what he says. I'm more inclined to believe the latter. As they realize they're getting closer to the Apache camp, they begin to move at night so that they won't be seen. Until finally, one night, they come across an entire Apache village full of nearly 1,000 people, men, women, and children alike. So, in a scene that is probably the most brutal in the entire book, at least through its descriptions, I am not going to read the entire thing here, but I'll give you a short
Thank God. Oh, good.
description. The Glanton gang encircles the village at night and begins riding in at all directions. To save ammo, they use clubs and begin to beat people on the outskirts of the village by riding by them and swinging their heavy mallets into their face. Once they get to the village, they begin to run the horses through the street as fast as they can. Glanton's horse specifically stepping on several women and children, murdering them as it gallops through the middle of the town. People on fire begin to pour out of the burning houses, and children as young as infants are brutally slaughtered. Most of the warriors had left the village at this point, which is what caused Glanton's gang to attack in this moment. But a few of them run out of the houses with lances and arrows and try to fight back, but it's of little use. In the night, several people try to escape down the shoreline of a lake until Glanton's men begin to ride in between them, picking them off one by one. It says whenever the sun starts to rise, that the entire village and the waters in front of it are bathed in red. Hundreds and hundreds of dead strewn between the burning houses and the shallow waters. Several of Glanton's men are trotting through the water, using clubs to kill anyone who still might be drowning, all the while taking as many scalps as they can. Glanton is mentioned as having a handful of heads in his hand that is tied up with the hair, with him clutching a fist of hair, jingling them like they're some sort of instrument walking through the street. And in his other hand, he has a spear with the head of the tribal leader, who he believes is a man named Gomez. Gomez was a leader of the Apaches, and there was a specifically high price for his head to be brought in. So stepping over the burning bodies of the children they killed and the noises and smells being described as he breaks bones as he's walking across them, he makes his way over to the judge and, gesturing towards the head on a stake, says, "Hey, does this look like Gomez to you?" The judge shook his head. "It's not Gomez." He nodded toward the thing. "That gentleman is Sangre Puro. Gomez is Mexican." "He ain't all Mexican. You can't be all Mexican. It's like being all mongrel. But that's not Gomez, because I've seen Gomez and it's not him. Will it pass for him?" "No." Glanton looked toward the south. He looked down at the judge. "You ain't seen my dog, have you?" There is something about that moment that hit me like a truck the first time I read through it. The description in the pages before is brutal with, like I said, the blood and sounds and descriptions of the dead. It is stomach churning, even for someone who's used to disturbing content. And you're just sick reading about it. And then you have him trying to figure out if he can get extra money out of his head. And then with concern, he goes, "Have you seen my dog?" Like, just such a detachment from anything resembling humanity, from any form that could be mustered of compassion or sympathy. It's just animalistic. Like, the dog is his, so it matters. But The dead bodies he's standing on top of are worth nothing more than the scalps on their heads. Also, in the midst of this, McGill, or his real name Miguel, the one Mexican in the group, steps out of a house with a lance through his stomach, slowly bleeding out. The kid, who hasn't really been mentioned in this altercation up until this point, starts to step forward to help Miguel, but then Glanton comes up behind him and tells the kid, "Stop, step away from him." And then whenever the kid steps away, Glanton pulls a gun, shoots Miguel, and then as soon as Miguel's on the ground, he scalps Miguel and keeps his scalp. Miguel was a guy who rode for him in a while, and the kid tried to show compassion, which was immediately shut down by Glanton. And hey, Miguel's Mexican, right? So they could probably sell his scalp as one of the natives, because, how is the Mexican government going to tell the difference? No honor among thieves to the point that your scalp can still be used for profit if possible. As they're leaving the Apache village, because they know that the Apache warriors will show up soon, they are also stealing all of their cattle. So as they're herding the cattle away from the village, it says that Glanton's dog comes up, and Glanton gently takes the dog and sets it on the pommel of his saddle. Because, again, he cares about this dog as opposed to the several human heads and scalps that are riding on the back of the horse. And it's also mentioned as they're leaving the village that the judge has a small native boy sitting on his lap at the front of the saddle. Alive, a living child, sitting at the front of his saddle. That night, while sitting around the camp, David Brown has an arrow where the top of the head is peeking through the other side of his thigh. So, Brown needs someone to push the arrow the rest of the way through so that they can cut off the head and pull it out. After several people say they're not going to help him, eventually the kid decides to do so. So, David bites down on a belt, the kid pushes the arrow through, and then they chop it in half and pull out the shaft. When the kid returned to his own blanket, the ex-priest leaned to him and hissed at his ear. "Fool," he said, "God will not love you forever." The kid turned to look at him. "Don't you know he'd have took you with him? He'd have took you, boy, like a bride to the altar." Tobin is highlighting the depravity of these men. If the kid had messed up and cut an artery or done anything to kill David on accident, David would have killed the boy, no question. Took him like a bride to the altar, as Tobin says. That's why no one else wanted to help David. They knew that if they did something wrong, David would probably kill him for it. And this is just the code among these men. I have got to take off this jacket. It is way too hot in here. Can I break the screen? No, we're good. Okay. Do I need to up the cowboy aesthetic? I've got this if we need it. Let me dare to put this on camera.
Looks nice.
I don't know how I feel about it. We'll leave it on for a bit. Why not? Remember that kid? This is so weird. Remember that kid that the judge took with him, took them out of the Apache village? Well, that kid has been with the boys for the past few nights. And then one morning, Toadvine wakes up, and the kid is sitting on the judge's lap, and he's bouncing it up and down. And Toadvine walks away, and 10 minutes later, he walks back, and the judge has killed the kid and is now scalping it. Toadvine, angered by this, pulls a gun and puts it to the judge's head. The judge says, "You either shoot or take that away. You do it now." And Toadvine, not willing to kill him, decocks the revolver and reholsters it. It's bizarre on both ends. Why would the judge keep this child for a few days just to then kill and scalp it like the rest, especially playing with it among the group? It says that they played games with it and would feed him jerky. And we'll talk about why that might be later. But also, it's a little weird if you think about it for Toadvine. Like, the reason Toadvine put the gun to the judge's head is because they had cared for this kid for a few days, right? But they had just massacred about 1,000 Apaches. And now Toadvine's threatening to kill the judge over this one? It's strange how these moral instances arise in the gang. How people so godless and without creed are willing to pick up arms over seemingly trivial actions. And I do agree that it is more sinister to keep the kid and then lull it into a sense of security for a few days and then kill it. But even then, in a strange way, it makes Toadvine a sort of hypocrite. Around this time, the gang begins to be chased by a group of Apaches. As they're running from them, the gang begins to run through small villages and haciendas to lose the Apaches in the ensuing slaughter. They ride in front of houses where men come out to greet them, only to immediately be murdered by the Apaches right behind them. Eventually, it works, And on July the 21st of 1849, the gang makes it back to Chihuahua City. They receive a hero's welcome. Women come out and throw roses at them, and men and merchants begin to throw them goods and gold. Because to the people, these are seen as the heroes. They are ridding the land of the evil people who seek to harm them whenever they step out of the city's gates. And it's bizarre to see this band of child murderers praised by the women as these heroic knights. They make it to the governor's courtyard and count up 128 scalps and 8 heads. Or in other words, a lot of money. After this, the men are promised that they'll be paid at dinner, and they all go to the public bathhouse, where they just destroy the water with all the caked gunpowder and blood and soot and dirt that's laid all over their skin. As they leave the bathhouse, they see that the scalps they had gathered now hang as banisters in front of the Capitol building. That felt too strange looking into the camera view over and over and seeing that hat on my head. We're back to this for now. That night at the dinner, Glennon is told that his men can sit at a different table while Glennon comes and dines with the governor. And Glennon refuses, saying he's not eating without his gang. While they're eating at the dinner table, the governor is giving some speech of bravery and camaraderie and the spirit of the Mexican government. And as he's giving the speech, the merchant comes in, or I guess the scalp dealer, who has the money for their scalps. And as soon as he hands the bag of gold and silver to Glanton, Glanton immediately quits caring about what the governor's talking about, and he throws the bag of money down on the dinner table, and using a knife, he separates each man his shares, and then they just get up and leave. They were only sitting around entertaining the governor for as long as there was food and they hadn't been paid. And as soon as they do get paid, they turn the entire city into a giant brothel. They go to the governor's house and take all his expensive furniture and throw it into a big bonfire. They go to all the random houses and bars and just start stealing alcohol and women. They'd walk out into the night drunk and just start shooting bullets into the sky. These scenes and scenes like them were repeated night after night. The citizenry made address to the governor, but he was much like the sorcerer's apprentice, who could indeed provoke the imp to do his will, but could in no way make him cease again. The baths had become bordellos, the attendants driven off. The white stone fountain in the plaza was filled at night with naked and drunken men. Cantinas were evacuated as if by fire, with the appearance of any two of the company, and the Americans found themselves in ghost taverns with drinks on tables and cigars still burning in the clay ashtrays. Horses were ridden indoors and out, and as the gold began to dwindle away, shopkeepers found themselves presented with debits scrawled on butcher paper in a foreign language for whole shells of goods. Stores began to close. Charcoal scrawls appeared on the lime-washed walls. Mejor los indios. The evening street stood empty, and there was no pesos, and the young girls of the city were boarded up and seen no more. So they're just a terror. As soon as they get their money, they become these debaucherous lunatics. I mean, they always were, but now they have money to actually act on it. They ride to another town and are once again greeted by a hero's welcome, and then it says 3 days later they leave and everyone's excited that they're gone. There's also mentions that they find these random groups of native people just by themselves defenseless, and as always, they slaughter them, take their scalps, and then sell them at the next town they ride into. Eventually, they make it to the town of Nakori, a small stowaway town that has a cantina. So the men go in to get drunk, and as soon as they sit down at the cantina, someone at a table next to theirs says something offensive, probably a reference to them being white and this far into Mexico. As soon as that table says something to them, the kid stands up, walks over to the table, and it says that he speaks in his, quote, wretched Spanish. He's trying to find out which of these drunk men said anything about him and his gang, but as they're talking, a funeral passes the street in front of the cantina. This funeral party that's walking through the center of town has a juggler at the front of it who is lighting rockets and performing tricks. It says that as the juggler passes the section of the street that has the gang's horses and the local Mexicans' horses, that the Mexicans' horses are freaked out by the explosions, but the gang's horses don't move, which is a sign of things to come, because those horses have heard their fair share of gunshots. And if the people in the cantina saw it, maybe they wouldn't have started a fight. Instead, at the sound of explosions, everyone goes out front to check. John Dorsey and Henderson Smith, two boys from Missouri, were the first into the street. They were followed by Charlie Brown and the judge. The judge could see over their heads and he raised one hand to those behind him. The buyer was just passing. The fiddler and the cornetist were making little bows to each other, and their steps suggested the martial style of the air they played. "It's a funeral," said the judge. As he spoke, the drunk with the knife, now reeling in the doorway, this is the man who insulted them whenever they walked in, now reeling in the doorway, sank the blade deep into the back of a man named Grimley. None saw it but the judge. Grimley put a hand on the rough wood frame of the door. "I'm killed," he said. The judge drew his belt pistol and leveled it above the heads of the men and shot the drunk through the middle of the forehead. Immediately, the cantina turns into a bloodbath. All that the gang sees is that the judge shot someone, so they figure he had a reason for it, and all that the Mexicans see is that the judge shot someone. So immediately both sides just start shooting each other. From inside came the uninterrupted sounds of gunfire, and the doorframe was filling up with smoke. In the middle of the gunfight, it says, "The survivors were making for the daylight in the doorway, and the first of these encountered the judge there and cut at him with his knife. But the judge was like a cat, and he sidestepped the man, seized his arm, and broke it, and picked the man up by his head. He put him against the wall and smiled at him, but the man had begun to bleed from the ears, and the blood was running down between the judge's fingers and over his hands, and when the judge turned him loose, there was something wrong with his head, and he slid to the floor and did not get up." Middle of a gunfight, knives and bullets flying everywhere, the judge grabs a man by his head, picks him up on the wall, and crushes his skull with his bare hand. Again, this guy is a monster among monsters. It says when the dust settles, the kid and Toadvine are in the center of the room back to back with their pistols in hand, smoking barrels, as they've been shooting at everyone who runs up at the windows. So now they have a problem. They are effectively contracted by the state of Mexico to save Mexican people from the natives. And now they just killed a whole lot of Mexicans. So that means they can't leave any witnesses of this. 3 men were running down the street to leave town, so the gang grabs their rifles and gun them down as they're trying to escape. As they're standing there amongst all the dead, none of them having been killed except for Grimley, who was stabbed in the back at the beginning of this and is now bleeding out. As they're standing there among the dead, Glannon thinks to himself what you guys have probably figured out at this point. There's not really a way for the Mexican government to tell what's a native scalp and what's a Mexican scalp.
Ah.
So as they're standing there,
Oh my god. Oh my.
among 36 dead Mexicans, he looks at the boys and says, "Here, boys, the string ain't run on this trade yet." So they just go about scalping everybody. It says in 10 minutes they scalp all 36 men and begin to make their way up out of the town. 30 minutes later, it says the people of the town begin to make their way to the cantina to care for the wounded, but at this point the damage has already been done. And as a matter of fact, why stop there? The next day they ride on another defenseless village and decide, hey, these are just a bunch of scalps ripe for the taking. So they go through this Mexican village and just start killing everyone. They run over them with their horses like they did to the native village. And it says
Of course.
that all the people in the town who are defenseless go to a church's altar and begin to pray. So the gang members walk up behind them and just start dragging them away from the altar one by one and begin to scalp them while they're still alive.
Um. Oh. No dignity. And they call the Mexicans and the Indians savages. They're the true savages.
Right there at the pulpit. Eventually, they're walking through another town, this one a bit too big to cause a fuss, but as they do, they are approached by a troop of Mexican soldiers who have likely heard word of their actions at this point. So, upon seeing the soldiers, before even seeing if the soldiers have anything to do with them or if they even know to be on the lookout for the Glanton gang, Glanton just pulls a rifle and shoots the commander. And immediately the street erupts into gunfire. It's a shootout between the Mexican soldiers and the gang. And while the gang managed to wipe out most of the soldiers, a few of them got away and started running down the street towards Chihuahua City. At this point, they're about 4 days out from the city, and the Mexican soldiers have about half a day's lead on them. So, over several days, they just continue to chase down these soldiers so that they can't get back to the capital and tell the governor what the Glanton gang is doing. Because, this massacre that happened out in the small town takes a while to get back to the head office. Eventually, only a couple hours outside of the gates of Chihuahua City, the gang catches up to them and guns the soldiers down. They quickly dig a ditch and put their bodies in it, of course after scalping them, and then stamp on the ground with the horses to make it look like it's nothing suspicious. And then, immediately after, they ride in Chihuahua City and sell the scalps of the Mexican villages they had slaughtered, as well as the soldiers that they had just slaughtered outside of the gates. They entered the city haggard and filthy and reeking with the blood of the citizenry for whose protection they had contracted. The scalps of the slain villagers were strung from the windows of the governor's house, and the partisans were paid out of the all but exhausted coffers, and the Sociedad was disbanded and the bounty rescinded. Within a week of their quitting the city, there would be a price of 8,000 pesos posted for Glanton's head. They rode out on the North Road, as would parties bound for El Paso, but before they were even quite out of the sight of the city, they had turned their tragic mounts to the west, and they rode infatuate and half-on towards the red demise of the day, toward the evening lands and the distant pandemonium of the sun. So they make their way into the city, sell Mexican scalps to the Mexican government, who are none the wiser, and then it says a week later there is a bounty for 8,000 pesos on Glanton's head. So for a while, they just make their way to these small towns who don't have word.
I dropped something here.
That, they're murderers yet. Well, they've always been murderers, but now they're murderers of Mexicans, so the government cares. These small towns don't have word of that, so they just go to these small towns and take their bounty and sell it on, again, women and booze until they terrorize the town so much they have to leave, and they just keep doing that. In one of these towns, it says while the judge finds a fiddler and begins to dance in the street, the men just start pulling out their guns and shooting pictures of Jesus Christ and Mary that are along the streets. So a priest walks out holding up a crucifix to ward them off because he rightfully thinks they're the devil, so they just beat him half to death in the street. There's this interesting moment whenever the priest stands up. It says that whenever he was on the ground, the men were throwing gold coins at him, mockingly. And then whenever the priest stands up, these young boys run out from the street and start to pick up the coins, and the priest stops them and says, "Bring the coins to me." And on hearing this, the gang begins to cheer and have a toast to him. Again, there are these constant defamations and blasphemies of both churches and images of God throughout the story. The next day was the Feast of Las Animas, and as opposed to a lot of the cities they were in, this town actually observed it, so they began to have their feast and their traditions to respect Christ. As they do this, it says, the judge sat alone in the cantina. He also watched the rain, his eyes small in his great and naked face. He'd filled his pockets with little candy death sheds, And he sat by the door and offered these to children passing on the walk under the eaves, but they shied away like little horses. Shortly after this, it says, by noon the day following, Glanton in his drunkenness was taken with a kind of fit, and he lurched crazed and disheveled into the little courtyard and began to open fire with his pistols. In the afternoon, he lay bound to his bed like a madman, while the judge sat with him and cooled his brow with rags of water and spoke to him in a low voice. Outside, voices called across the steep hillsides. A little girl was missing, and parties of citizens had turned out to search the mine shafts. After a while, Glanton slept, and the judge rose and went out. Keep that mention in mind for later. As the judge walks out in the street, a young boy bound to his bed like a madman, while the judge sat outside. Voices called across the steep hillsides. A little girl was missing, and parties of citizens had turned out to search the mine shafts. After a while, Glanton slept, and the judge rose and went out. Keep that mention in mind for later. As the judge walks out in the street, a young boy standing by the bridge is holding two puppies that he's trying to sell. The boy's trying to sell the dogs, so the judge reaches into his pocket and pulls out a gold coin that the story says is worth a bushel of these dogs. So he gives the boy the golden coin, and the judge takes the two puppies into his hand and smiles at the boy and walks over to the bridge and throws the puppies into a river. As he does that,
Of course.
Bathcat is standing underneath the bridge, peeing into it, and whenever he sees the puppies fly into the river, he pulls his gun and shoots them as they're floating down the water. If this is done out of mercy or out of meanness, the story never says. But what is apparent is it seems while the judge gave far too much money for these two puppies, it was well worth it to him to be able to extinguish a life that wasn't his own. In the meantime, Glanton, who's stumbling drunk out of bed and seemingly has no purpose in his life now that he can't kill people for money, because good luck finding a local governor's house that he can sell the scalps at, he just decides to start a problem. He cuts down a Mexican flag and ties it to the tail of a mule and just starts walking the mule down the street for fun, thinking it's funny to, drag the flag across the dirt. Eventually, someone gets tired of this, and as Glanton rounds a corner, someone pulls a gun and fires at him. Immediately, Glanton fires back, and it erupts into a gunfight with all of the gang showing up to just start shooting at random people in this Mexican town. Eventually, the gang realizes they're outgunned, and they all mount their horses and ride out of the city, leaving 6 of their dead and wounded behind. After they get out of the town, a couple of gang members who were held up join up with the gang and say that the locals were taking their wounded, the Glanton gang's wounded, and they dragged them into the street, and the priest baptized them before a soldier executed them. Which the baptism before death is much more mercy that the Mexicans are giving to the Glanton gang than the Glanton gang are giving to the Mexicans. So they continue on their journey, and they get to this section where it is a switchback on the side of a cliff face, or in other words, like the mountain does this. And it's a very narrow walkway because this is a path to a mercury mine at the base of the mountain. So as the Glanton gang begins to walk on it, there are several mine workers who are whipping mules up the cliff face as they have bags of mercury saddled over them. So the Glanton gang just ignores them, and Glanton at the front just pushes through this group of mules and is so close to several of the mules that the mules are about to step over the cliff face. And eventually, Glanton steps by one of the riders, or one of the people who are ushering the mules up these hills, and the man begins to yell at Glanton. Glanton pays him no mind, and after Glanton passed, the man pulls out a gun. So immediately on seeing this, with no hesitation, David Brown just pulls his own gun and shoots the worker. And at the gunfire, every member of the gang just starts slaughtering the mules and the people working them. The novel describes this as bad luck on behalf of the mine workers. They just so happened to run into the Glanton gang, which, of course, surely meant death. It talks about the mules falling over the cliff face hundreds of feet, screaming, only to explode in a pop of silver and red. A scene that isn't really explained is when they get to the base of the mountain that night, the judge points out that Black Jackson's missing, so the judge and a couple of the Delawares go to find him, and they bring him back, but it says when they bring him back They had the black with him. He was naked save for a blanket he'd wrapped himself in. He didn't even have boots. He was riding one of the bone-tailed pack mules from the conducta, and he was shivering with cold. The only thing he'd saved was his pistol. He was holding it against his chest under the blanket, for he had no other place to carry it. So perhaps Jackson tried to defect, so whenever the judge found him, he shamed him by making him strip naked to ride back into camp. Or maybe he lost his clothes or got separated. I don't know. Make of that interaction what you will. Knowing what we know about the judge later in the story, I'm kind of inclined to believe it was a type of shaming. So as the gang, especially the Lantern, is kind of at a breaking point, they have no purpose anymore. Well, beyond what little purpose they had of murder and money, but now they can't even do that. So everyone's kind of losing their mind. They're just killing for the sake of killing, except for the judge, who seems completely unbothered by everything that's happening.
And I'm gonna pause for a little bit. And I'm back, and I turned on the lights because, I mean, honestly, it's gotten a bit too dark for a reason. I hope you don't mind the switch up by the mood.
At this point, also, they've gone so far south, so they're beginning to hit the
What? What was that?
that's happening. At this point, also, they've gone so far south, so they're beginning to hit the jungle. And it says as they're walking through the jungle, the judge.
Oh, I see. So they've gone so far south that they're reaching the jungle area. Well, they're a long way from home.
Is just like shooting birds and catching butterflies to catalog and draw pictures of in his book. So eventually, one night when they're sitting around the fire, Toadvine looks at him and says, "What's the point of this book and all of this cataloging he does anyway?" Which leads to another of my favorite scenes in the entire novel. The judge's quill ceased its scratching. He looked at Toadvine. Then he continued to write again. Toadvine spat into the fire. The judge wrote on, and then he folded the ledger shut and laid it to one side and pressed his hands together and passed them down over his nose and mouth and placed them palm down on his knees. "Whatever exists," he said, "whatever in creation exists without my knowledge, exists without my consent." He looked about at the dark forest in which they were bivouacked. He nodded towards the specimens he'd collected. "These anonymous creatures," he said, "may seem little or nothing in the world, yet the smallest crumb can devour us. Any smallest thing beneath yon rock out of men's knowing. Only nature can enslave man, and only when the existence of each last entity is routed out and made to stand naked before him will he properly suzerain of the earth." What's a suzerain? A keeper or overlord. Why not say keeper then? Because he is a special kind of keeper. A suzerain rules even where there are other rulers. His authority countermands local judgments. Toadvine spat. The judge placed his hands on the ground. He looked at his inquisitor. "This is my claim," he said, "and yet everywhere upon it are pockets of autonomous life. Autonomous. In order for it to be mine, nothing must be permitted to occur upon it save by my dispensation." Toadvine sat with his boots crossed before the fire. "No man can acquaint himself with everything on this earth," he said. The judge tilted his great head. "The man who believes that the secrets of the world are forever hidden lives in mystery and fear. Superstition will drag him down. The rain will erode the deeds of his life. But the man who sets himself the task of singling out the thread of order from the tapestry will by decision alone have taken charge of the world, and it is only by such taking charge that he will effect a way to dictate the terms of his own fate." I don't see what that has to do with catching birds. The freedom of the birds is an insult to me. I'd have them all in zoos. That'd be a hell of a zoo. The judge smiled. "Yes," he said. "Even so." The judge has such an interesting and almost selfish outlook on the world. He touches the dirt and says, "This is my claim, the world and everything in it. And anything in this world that exists without my knowledge doesn't look to me for permission. It exists without my consent." He says the freedom of the birds, the autonomy of them, is an insult to him. He'd rather they all be locked up in zoos because then it would be cataloged and it would be under his command. He is not trying to be the master of his own destiny. He is trying to be the warlord of everyone else's. After this, once again, the gang does the same thing where they go to a small town and there's a hostel and they take it over and have a party and burn stuff in the backyard. So the men make it to Sonora, and out here they don't have word of what the Glanton gang's done yet, so they get another contract to collect native scalps. So they immediately go back to the new, much easier trick than fighting armed natives, and instead just massacre another Mexican village. This time, while they're on their way back, they are approached by Mexican cavalry led by General Elias. In the fight, Glanton's gang is outgunned and immediately begins an escape. However, in the initial shootout, 3 of them are dead and 7 of them are injured. That night, they can see out in the horizon the fires of Elias' soldiers. They're being chased through the desert, and it doesn't seem like Elias is going to lose interest in them anytime soon. Elias, again, was a general of the Mexican military who didn't take kindly to Glanton killing Mexican civilians. Of those 7 that are wounded, 4 of them are wounded so badly that they can no longer ride. And if they leave these men behind to the Mexican soldiers, then there's no telling what the Mexicans will do to them. So the gang decides to draw lots. They take arrows out of a quiver and they wrap pieces of flannel to them. And whoever draws the arrow with the flannel has to stay behind to put down the wounded soldier. The 4 men that are wounded are 2 of the Delaware Indians, a Mexican who is new to the gang, or I guess was new to the gang, and a man named Dick Shelby. There's this weird moment whenever the kid goes up to draw arrows, where it says, he sat on the ground with the quiver upright between his knees while the company filed past. When the kid selected among the shafts to draw one, he saw the judge watching him, and he paused. He looked at Glanton, he let go the arrow he'd chosen, and sorted out another and drew that one. It carried the red tassel. He looked at the judge again, and the judge was not watching, and he moved on and took his place with Tate and Webster. So they're sitting there casting arrows, and right before the kid goes to, the judge is staring him down. And it changes the kid's mind, and sure enough, the arrow that he pulls next has the flannel attached to it. It's like the judge is instrumenting the kid's life to put him in these horrific scenarios. Again, it's an instance of fate, perhaps. Or perhaps the judge is an agent of it. So the kid's standing there with the 3 other men who drew the arrows, and then one of the uninjured Delaware Indians walks up to the line and goes to 2 of the men and takes their arrows from them, because the Delaware sees it more fitting that he kills his own people rather than them. They walks up to the line and goes to 2 of of it. So the kid's standing there with the 3 other men who drew the arrows, and then one of the uninjured Delaware Indians walks up to the line and goes to 2 of the men and takes their arrows from them, because the Delaware sees it more fitting that he kills his own people rather than them. They watch as the Delaware walks to the 2 other injured Delaware, and he takes a club and just caves their head in and leaves. So that leaves the kid and a man named Tate to kill the wounded Mexican and Dick Shelby. At this point, everyone else in the gang has started to move out so they can get some ground on the soldiers, and Tate and the kid need to finish what they're about to do fast. So after everyone leaves, the conversation picks up. Tate squatted in the sand, his hands dangling in front of him. He turned and looked at the kid. "Who gets the Mexican?" he said. The kid didn't answer. They looked at Shelby. He was watching them. Tate had a clutch of small pebbles in his hand, and he let them drop one by one into the sand. He looked at the kid. "Go on if you want to," the kid said. He looked at the Delawares, dead in their blankets. "You might not do it," he said. "That ain't your worry. Glanton might come back. He might." Tate looked over to where the Mexican was lying, and he looked at the kid again. "I'm still held to it," he said. The kid didn't answer. "You know what they'll do to them?" The kid spat. "I can guess," he said. "No, you can't. I said you could go. You do what you want." The kid senses that Tate's having trouble thinking about putting these men that he probably considers friends, down. So the kid tells Tate to get out of there. Again, it's one of those instances of the kid's weird rule of mercy, and something we're about to see another instance of right after. So Tate leaves, and now the kid is standing there by himself with the Mexican and Shelby. The kid sat in the sand and stared off to the south. The Mexican was shot through the lungs and would die anyway, but Shelby had his hips shattered by a ball. He was clear in his head. He lay watching the kid. He was from a prominent Kentucky family and had attended Transylvania College, and like many another young man of his class, he'd gone west because of a woman. He watched the kid, and he watched the enormous sun where it sat boiling on the edge of the desert. Any road agent or gambler would have known that the first to speak would lose, but Shelby had already lost it all. Man, I love the way McCarthy writes these scenes. Any road agent or gambler would know that the first to speak would lose, but Shelby had already lost it all. It makes me want to scream. It's such a good book. Why don't you just get it on with, he said. That's Shelby talking. The kid looked at him. If I had a gun, I'd shoot you, Shelby said. The kid didn't answer. You know that, don't you? You ain't got a gun, the kid said. He looked to the south again. Something moving, perhaps the first lines of heat. No dust in the morning so early. When he looked at Shelby again, Shelby was crying. You won't thank me if I let you off, he said. Do it then, you son of a bitch. The kid sat. A light wind was blowing out of the north, and some doves had begun to call in the thicket of greasewood behind them. If you want me just to leave you, I will. Shelby didn't answer. He pushed a furrow in the sand with the heel of his boot. You'll have to say. Will you leave me a gun? You know I can't leave you no gun. You're no better than him, are you? The kid didn't answer. What if he comes back? Glanton? Yes. What if he does? He'll kill me. You won't be out nothing. Kid's like, oh, I'd kill you? Yeah, we wouldn't want that to happen now, wouldn't we? You won't be out nothing, you son of a bitch. The kid rose. Will you hide me? Hide you? Yes. The kid spat. You can't hide. Where are you going to hide at? Will he come back? I don't know. This is a terrible place to die in. Where's a good one? Shelby wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist. Can you see them? He said. Not yet. Will you pull me up under that bush? The kid turned and looked at him. He looked off down country again, and then he crossed the basin and squatted behind Shelby and took him up under the arms and raised him. Shelby's head rolled back, and he looked up, and then he snatched at the butt of the pistol stuck in the kid's belt. The kid seized his arm, he let him down and stepped away and turned him loose. When he returned through the basin leading the horse, the man was crying again. He took the pistol from his belt and jammed it among his belongings, lashed to the cantle, took his canteen down, and went to him. He had his face turned away. The kid filled his flask from his own and reseated the stopper where it hung by its thong and drove it home with the heel of his hand. Then he rose and looked off to the south. Yonder they come, he said. Shelby raised up on one elbow. The kid looked at him and he looked at the faint and formless articulation along the horizon of the sky. Shelby lay back. He was staring up at the sky. A dark overcast was moving down from the north and the wind was up. A clutch of leaves scuttled out of the willow bracken at the edge of the sand and then scuttled back again. The kid crossed to where the horse stood waiting, took the pistol, stuck it in his belt, hung the canteen over the saddle horn, mounted up and looked back at the wounded man. Then he rode out. Even though Shelby reached for the kid's gun, even though he was probably going to kill him in that moment, the kid went over to him and in the middle of the hot desert, he refilled a dying man's canteen with his own water. One of the elements of this story that becomes more apparent, I think, whenever you think of the ending, the place it ends, is the kid's morality is almost subjective. And in my opinion, I'm jumping the gun on the analysis a bit, but in my opinion, I think that is the greatest thing that would be lost if you made this into a film. Like, yeah, studios won't do it because of the brutal depictions of elderly women and babies being murdered, right? But from a thematic perspective, whenever you read this story, it is almost up to you how evil the kid is. Because, like, in all the mentions earlier in the story, whenever it's talking about the gang scalping people, murdering people, the kid is never mentioned in the violence. He is definitely there, and he's mentioned afterwards. Like, for example, whenever they slaughtered the Apache village, The kid isn't mentioned through the entire slaughter. He's mentioned at the end whenever he sees that Miguel has been stabbed. And that's the first time he comes back into the tale. So you can imagine the kid as going through and just massacring people along with the rest of the gang, or kind of being a witness to it all. Nowhere else to be in the world. This is just where he lives. So in moments like this, where I don't know, in moments like this, where there's an act of mercy that is unseen by the other members of the gang, or unthinkable even by the other members of the gang. I don't know. It feeds this idea that perhaps the kid, definitely not innocent, but is more blameless than most. It's so interesting to me. I heard people talking about this story, like, people giving lectures on it and stuff, and they would talk about a kid that was not my kid. It was not, the way they would describe his actions and his evil were completely different from what I envisioned in my head, and I heard other people who treated the kid much more favorably than I had in my head. And it's like, not only is the kid an audience surrogate in a way, because he's what we see the actions of the story through, but he's almost a moral, I don't know, imprint. It's weird. What you think he's most likely to do in this scenario is what he does, except for instances like this. And because of that, and because of where the story ends, I like to think that perhaps the kid is different from the rest of the gang in some way. He might be nihilistic, he might be empty with, compassion of man, but he's not a man hunter. He's not a monster, at least not yet. I don't know, it's an interesting aspect of the story, something I don't see done a lot. So the kid is riding up the trail to catch.
Interesting point. Interesting point. And we are back. So what he said was definitely very interesting. Yes, I haven't been commenting much. I guess just haven't really had much to say.
Catch up with the gang, and as he does, he sees a lone rider standing offside of his horse. As he gets closer, he realizes that this is Tate. As the kid rides up, he sees that the horse is standing on 3 legs, which is not a good sign. The kid begins by speaking to Tate. Can he walk? Not much. He got down and drew up the horse's leg. The frog of the hoof was split and bloody, and the animal's shoulder quivered. He let the hoof down. The sun was about 2 hours high, and now there was dust on the horizon. A couple things to note. The reason that the horse's hoof split is because earlier in the story, whenever they were being tracked, I believe it was by the Mexican army, the Mexican army was able to follow them easier because they just looked for the horseshoes in the ground. So they de-shoed the horses, which is what caused this injury. The other detail is that dust on the horizon is the Mexican army getting closer, so this is quickly becoming a problem. He looked at Tate. What do you want to do? I don't know, lead him a while, see how he does? He ain't gonna do. I know it. We could ride and tie. You might just keep riding. I might anyway. Tate looked at him. Go on if you want, he said. The kid spat. Come on, he said. I hate to leave the saddle. Hate to leave the horse far as that goes. The kid picked up the trailing reins of his own animal. You might change your mind about what you hate to leave, he said. I love the kid. I love his dialogue. Like, when he doesn't speak that much, but when he does speak, it's always some matter-of-fact statement that I love. So both of them are now walking their horses at a much, much slower rate, and Tate has to keep fighting his animal to make it move forward. I should also mention that I know the passage of time's probably weird in my description. It's more better defined in the story, and now they've worked their way back north, and they are now in the mountains around Sonora. I mentioned that because it's about to start snowing, and that'd be really weird considering last I mentioned they were in the jungle. The gang's been riding with the kid for going on a year at this point. Eventually, the snow got blowing to such a degree that they had to wrap in their blankets and face away from it as it pelted them in the eyes. They can barely see a few feet in front of them, and Tate says, "Ain't this hell?" he said. "Will your horse lead?" "Hell no, I can hardly make him follow." We get turned around, we might just run plumb into the Spaniards. I never seen it turn so cold so quick. What do you want to do? We better go on. We could pull for the high country. As long as we keep going uphill, we'll know we ain't gone in a circle. We'll get cut off. We never will find Glanton. We're cut off now. Tate turned and stared bleakly to where the whirling flakes blew down from the north. Let's go, he said. We can't stand here. So they eventually get up to a little, cliffside in the snow and decide to wrap themselves in their sleeping bags for the night. The next day, the kid wakes up underneath a pile of snow because he hears footsteps. The kid, underneath the snow, grabs his gun and sets upright, throwing the snow off of him, and when he does, he sees 5 Mexican soldiers walking up on him with rifles. Immediately, the kid pulls his pistol and shoots the one in front of him before rolling out of the sleeping bag, grabbing his boots, and sprinting down the mountainside as he fires bullets behind him. Up on the mountainside, he can hear gunshots continue to go off, and from here, Tate is never mentioned again. Well, he's mentioned, but he's never seen again. So it's more than likely that the Mexican soldiers killed him up there on the mountain. From here, we're treated to this interesting scene where it's kind of like the beginning of the novel, where the kid is traveling across the countryside of his own, seeing the remnants of war and nature as it carries around him, and he's just kind of a voyager through it. It's so cold that he can't feel his feet, and as he's walking, he's picking up patches of snow and keeps eating it to stay hydrated. He sleeps curled up in a ball, having lost his sleeping bag on top of the mountain, wrapped around his pistol, as it's the only artifact he has and the only thing that could possibly save him. As he's walking one night, again, it's been a few nights of him walking over the mountaintops through the cold. As he's walking, he looks out in the darkness, and he sees a solitary fire. It's weird. There's several scenes in this book that I continue to think about after I finish reading it. One of the primary ones being the ending of the book, which, again, we'll get to. But probably next to that, the scene I find myself thinking of the most, or thinking what it might mean, is this. He continues to walk through the darkness, through the fog. It says,
Mm-hmm. Now, pause there for a little bit. There you go, I just I missed the part where he got where he lost his sleeping bag, and so I backed it up. Yeah.
as he's walking, he looks out in the one of the primary ways a save him. As he's walking, he looks out in the darkness and he sees a solitary fire. It's weird. There's several scenes in probably next to that, the scene I find myself thinking of the most, or thinking what it might mean, is this. He continues to walk through the darkness, through the fog. It says a couple of times, it seems that the image of the fire is cut off. He thinks maybe wolves are running in between him and the fire, but it doesn't distract him from it. He keeps pushing on. And when he gets there, it was a lone tree burning on the desert, a heraldic tree that the passing storm had left afire. The solitary pilgrim, drawn up before it, had traveled far to be here, and he knelt in the hot sand and held his numbed hands out, while all about in that circle attended companies of lesser auxiliaries routed forth into the inordinate day. Small owls that crouched silently and stood from foot to foot, and tarantulas and solpugas and vinegaroons and the vicious mygale spiders and beaded lizards with mouths black as a chow dog's, deadly to man, and the little desert basilisks that jet blood from their eyes, and the small sand vipers like seemly gods, silent and the same in Jeddah and Babylon. A constellation of ignited eyes that edged that ring of light, all bound in precarious truce before this torch, whose brightness had set back the stars in their sockets. I think this will make more sense later. But for me, this was the turning point of the novel. The kid has witnessed horrific atrocities of man over and over again. And some things nearly unspeakable in how evil they are. And now, he is separate from the gang. He is apart from them. He is his own agent, if desperate, still, acting on his own here, in his own accordance. And just before the scene happened, he had done everything to be right by his fellow man. He had he spared Shelby. Shelby didn't want to be shot, it seemed, so the kid didn't do it. He stuck with Tate, and that's what put him in this situation, but he wouldn't leave his man alone. And it's like now, after all of that happened, he's given a herald, a blazing tree left by a storm in the middle of this tundra. And it says that it's an offering of salvation, that he's near freezing to death, about to lose his hands, and he can use the fire to warm his hands. But this boy who has at least been complicit with evil all this time, as he stands there before a burning altar surrounded by the snakes and the spiders, he crawls before it humble, a pilgrim, as the story describes, and he draws warmth from it. And it's also not to be overlooked how the image of a burning tree in the wilderness directly harkens back to the biblical story of Moses and the burning bush. But here, God isn't speaking. It's just quiet. It's just a salvation that happens for him. Even if for a moment, it keeps him going to the next day. And I'll come back to this scene when we get to the ending. But I think his decision after this, his decision to walk back towards the gang, is, how do I phrase this? Is symbolically the final step of his journey. He eventually comes off the mountain and gets back on the trail the gang was following. As he's walking down the trail, he sees a giant smoldering mass, and when he gets closer to it, he realizes it's all of the gang's scalps thrown into a pile and burned. This is twofold. For one, they're not going back to Sonora to sell these things, not while being chased by the Sonoran military. So that's out. There's no reason to carry them. And two, they are about to try to make deals with the natives, and if you show up with a horse full of native scalps, they're probably not going to be in a talking mood. Eventually, the kid makes it back to the gang. At this point, he had found one of the horses that the gang had left behind in the desert, and he managed to get on top of it and catch up with them. When he gets there, he finds that 4 more have been killed, and the gang as a whole is in a very bad state of being. That night, they're all starving, so the judge walks over and finds the most sickly looking horse and decides to kill it for meat. He asks the men to come help him, and no one will except for the kid, who again volunteers. However, this time, unlike he did with David Brown, the priest tries to stop him. Tobin
Sorry for pausing some.
says, "Pay him no mind, lad." The judge called again from the dark beyond the fire, and the ex-priest placed a cautionary hand upon the kid's arm.
I'm gonna back it up.
Kill it for me. He asks the men to come help him, and no one will except for the kid, who again volunteers. However, this time, unlike he did with David Brown, the priest tries to stop him. Tobin says, "Pay him no mind, lad." The judge called again from the dark beyond the fire, and the ex-priest placed a cautionary hand upon the kid's arm. But the kid rose and spat into the fire. He turned and eyed the ex-priest. "You think I'm afraid of him?" The ex-priest didn't answer, and the kid turned and went out into the darkness where the judge waited. He stood holding the horse, just his teeth glistened in the firelight. Together they led the animal off a little ways, and the kid held the woven riata while the judge took up a round rock weighing perhaps 100 pounds and crushed the horse's skull with a single blow. Blood shot out of its ears, and it slammed to the ground so hard that one of its forelegs broke under it with a dull snap. That's such an interesting note. For one, we see more of the brutality of the judge, that he's able to pick up this boulder and just smash its head. But that quick mention of the kid about to go help him and the priest tries to stop him, this will become more prevalent as the story goes on. They spend some days going from town to town, staying in dingy stables to stay away from the cold, and eventually they come to an old deserted mission, or effectively a church that several people would live at that would also operate as sort of a community center. They decide to go check it out, and a few of the men enter the church before Glanton and some of the others, and as they're riding up to the church, they hear a gunshot. Quickly, everyone runs inside to see what's going on. They walk in to see their men reloading a rifle, and some stranger lying dying on the floor in between them. The man in the floor was dying, and he was dressed altogether in homemade clothes of sheep hide, even to boots and a strange cap. They turned him over on the cracked clay tiles, and his jaw moved, and a bloody spittle formed along his lower lip. His eyes were dull, and there was fear in them, and there was something else. John Pruitt stood the butt of his rifle on the floor and swung his horn about to recharge the piece. "I seen another one run," he said. "There's two of them." The man on the floor began to move. He had one arm lying in his groin, and he moved it slightly and pointed. At them, or at the height from which he had fallen, or to his destination in eternity, they did not know. Then he died. Something about that, just a man dying, and all this details about him in his last moments. It's so melancholic. So they said that as they walked in, there was a hole in the ceiling, and there were two guys up top. So Pruitt took his rifle and shot one of them, and he had fallen from the ceiling to the church floor, and that's the scene that everyone walked in on. The rest of the gang finds this second man and brings him before Glanton. He's babbling like a fool and speaks no English and a little Spanish. So then the judge begins to speak to him normally because it turns out they both speak German. It's explained that the man who they shot, who fell to the ground, was that second man's brother, and that the two of them had jumped off of a boat some time ago that was coming over from Germany, and they had been living in this abandoned mission for quite some time. So the gang decides to leave him there. And as they're riding away, it says the judge caught Glanton up and they rode side by side out to the road. Glanton spat. "Order shot that one too," he said. The judge smiled. "I don't like to see white men that way," Glanton said. "Dutch or whatever. I don't like to see it." As the men continued to ride, it was mentioned earlier that they sent out a scouting party ahead to see if there is any danger on the horizon. As the men continue to ride, they find the scouting party hung upside down from the thorns of a tree, with thorns ran through their heels as they had been slowly cooked by the natives that had captured them. One of these men who was hanging upside down on the tree was Bathcap, and as it was prophesied near the beginning of the book, Toadvine walks up to him and cuts him down from the tree. Observing that tattoo that it was mentioned all the way back then, he would see when he cut his naked torso from a tree in the wilderness. They continue riding, and eventually they come across an Apache village. Now typically this would be the part where the gang starts murdering them, but now, because the gang doesn't have the faculties to do that, and also they can't get paid for it, they decide that why not talk to the Apaches for once? The Apaches are standing there with their leader out front, so Glanton walks up to the leader and the two approach each other, and as soon as Glanton starts to talk to him, Glanton's horse reaches forward and bites the ear of the Apache leader's horse. Just rips the ear out. Blood starts spurting everywhere because Glanton's war horse is so used to killing, and more specifically killing anyone who looks like these Apaches, that it just immediately goes to fight. And Glanton has to start punching it in the face to make it stop. So immediately, the Apaches and the gang begin to draw weapons on each other. But before anyone can fire, the judge rides up and begins his smooth talking. The leader comes to them and the gang says they don't want any trouble and they're just looking to barter. The Apaches agree that they'll let bygones be bygones if they can trade money for whiskey. The gang says that they don't have any whiskey, but at this point they're pretty close to Tucson, Arizona. So they tell the Apaches that if they give them 3 days, they'll be back to trade a barrel of whiskey for gold. So now, back in America, the gang is in Tucson, and they are met by an American lieutenant named Couts. And again, Couts has no idea what the Glanton gang's been up to. So they meet each other, exchange their pleasantries, and then the gang goes to a bar to get drunk and eat food. They also need to rebuild the gang. So as a lot of these men go to bars to get drunk, Glanton and the judge start to walk through the town, seeing if anyone's interested in joining up for a ride to California. Everyone in the streets kind of laugh at them until eventually someone says, "Hey, go to the end of the road and see if Klaus and that madman want to go with you." So
Further, I think I'm gonna end the video right here, if you don't mind. Don't worry, the last and final part will be uploaded this evening, so you don't have to wait too long.